Elon Musk is not rich. Not by historical standards. Not even close. In 2024, Musk's net worth peaked at approximately $400 billion. That is an almost incomprehensible sum of money. It is enough to buy every NFL franchise, every Premier League club, and every Formula One team, simultaneously, and still have change. And compared to the wealthiest family in human history, it is a rounding error. The family I am talking about lived in the 15th and 16th centuries. They came from a German city most people today have never heard of. The founder started his career as a junior clerk in a textile business, and at his peak, he personally controlled approximately 2% of the entire European economy. Not 2% of a company, not 2% of an industry, 2% of a continent. His name was Jakob Fugger, and this video is going to explain precisely and mathematically why that comparison is not hyperbole. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can't compare a medieval German merchant to a 21st century tech billionaire. Different economies, different currencies, different concepts of what wealth even means. You're right. You cannot directly compare raw numbers across 6 centuries. But economists who study historical wealth have developed a method that makes the comparison possible. It's called GDP share. What fraction of the total economy did this person personally control? Not how many dollars did they have, but what percentage of all the economic activity happening around them did they command? By that measure, the only measure that makes cross-century comparison meaningful, the gap between Elon Musk and Jakob Fugger is not close. It is not even in the same order of magnitude. And I want to show you the numbers, because the numbers are the story. Current global GDP, approximately $110 trillion. Elon Musk at his peak, $400 billion, approximately 0.36% of global GDP. Now, the modern global economy is integrated in a way the medieval European economy wasn't. A fairer comparison restricts to the primary economy Musk actually operates within. The United States has a GDP of approximately $27 trillion. 400 billion against 27 trillion. Approximately 1.5% of the US economy. That is genuinely extraordinary by any modern standard. No individual in the modern world has ever come close to that. Now, Jakob Fugger at his peak, approximately 2% of the entire European economy. Not one country, the continent. By GDP share, Fugger's wealth was roughly equivalent to Musk's, or modestly higher. But GDP share alone doesn't capture the full picture. Because what Fugger could do with his wealth, the direct leverage it gave him over sovereign political power, over wars, over the election of emperors, was categorically different from what any modern billionaire can do. And that is the real story. One more thing before we start. The title says 1,000 times wealthier. The accurate number by GDP share is closer to 700 times. We round it up because that is the closest round number that fits on a thumbnail. I am telling you, we are not exaggerating. 700 times wealthier is not a figure that requires exaggeration. Let's talk about how he got there. Before we talk about what Musk doesn't have, let's be precise about what he does. Elon Musk's wealth is primarily equity, stakes in companies he founded, co-founded, or acquired. Tesla, the electric vehicle and energy company that has done more to accelerate the global transition away of fossil fuels than perhaps any other single organization. SpaceX, the private aerospace company that has reduced the cost of launching a kilogram of payload to orbit by roughly 90% compared to pre-SpaceX prices. X, formerly Twitter, the social media platform that, whatever you think of how it has been run, is one of the most significant public communications infrastructure companies in the world. xAI, Neuralink, the Boring Company, a portfolio of ventures attacking problems from artificial intelligence to neural interfaces to urban transport. By any reasonable standard, this is an extraordinary commercial achievement. These are not paper companies. They are real organizations employing hundreds of thousands of people, generating real revenues, and in several cases, genuinely advancing the technical frontier of what is possible. I want to be clear about this, because the comparison I am about to draw is not meant to diminish it. It is meant to calibrate it. There is a difference between extraordinary by modern standards and extraordinary by the standards of the most powerful individuals who have ever existed. Musk is the former. The family we are about to discuss was the latter. Let me be more precise about the GDP share comparison, because the details matter. When economists calculate Musk's wealth as a share of the economy, they typically use either global GDP or US GDP. Global GDP comparison: 400 billion divided by 110 trillion equals 0.36%. US GDP comparison: 400 billion divided by 27 trillion equals approximately 1.5%. The US comparison is more useful because Musk's wealth is primarily denominated in US assets and US currency. 1.5% of the US economy. That is the most generous, reasonable estimate of Musk's economic position. Now, Jakob Fugger at his peak. Historians estimate his personal wealth at somewhere between 1 and 2% of total European GDP. The most cited figure is around 2%. That is the comparison: 1.5% of the US economy versus 2% of the European economy. On raw GDP share, these figures are actually reasonably close. So why does the comparison still decisively favor Fugger? Because of what the money could do. Because of the relationship between private wealth and public power in each era. And that relationship was completely different. Here's the crucial distinction that the raw GDP share comparison doesn't fully capture. Elon Musk's wealth exists within a framework of constraints: antitrust law, securities regulation, tax law, democratic accountability, the regulatory apparatus of the most powerful state in human history. Musk cannot buy an election in the direct sense that Fugger bought an election. He can donate to political campaigns within legal limits. He can own media platforms and use them to influence public opinion. He can lobby governments, apply political pressure, build relationships with heads of state. But he cannot walk into a room with 7 electoral princes, hand them cash, and determine who becomes the leader of a continent. He cannot write a letter to the President of the United States saying, "I made you. Pay me back." He cannot use the debt a sovereign owes him as leverage to suppress legislation he doesn't like. All of these things are things that Jakob Fugger did. As a matter of documented historical record, the reason they are impossible today is not that no one has tried to do them. It is that 5 centuries of institutional development were specifically designed to prevent them. The modern world was, in significant part, built as a response to what families like the Fuggers demonstrated was possible when private wealth was unconstrained by institutional checks. Musk is extraordinarily wealthy. He is also extraordinarily constrained. Fugger was moderately wealthier by GDP share, and essentially unconstrained. That is the comparison that matters. Jakob Fugger was born in 1459 in Augsburg, Germany. His family were textile merchants, successful by local standards, entirely unknown outside Augsburg. Jakob was the youngest of several brothers. He had been intended for the church. His older brothers ran the family business, and, needing staff as it grew, pulled him out of his clerical education and set him to work as a junior clerk. He was, at this stage, approximately 14 years old. He was not supposed to lead anything. He was the spare, not the heir. But his brothers had made an error of judgment that only became apparent over the following decade. The youngest Fugger was not like the others. He was sent to Venice to train in the most sophisticated commercial environment in Europe. He spent years learning the instruments of Venetian finance: bills of exchange, marine insurance, complex partnership structures. The philosophy that information and relationships are more valuable than goods. He returned to Augsburg a different person than the one who had left. And within 20 years of taking a meaningful role in the family business, he had transformed it from a Swabian textile operation into the dominant private financial institution on the European continent. Consider the speed of that trajectory. Musk founded his first company at 24. By his mid-40s, he was the richest person alive. Fugger entered commerce as a teenager. By his mid-40s, he controlled more of his continent's economy than anyone before or since. The timelines are comparable. The scale of what they built is not. The specific mechanism of Fugger's wealth is important to understand, because it is structurally different from Musk's. In 1487, Fugger made the deal that changed everything. Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol needed money. He had silver mines, among the most productive in Europe, but needed cash now, against revenues he would receive gradually over time. Fugger advanced him the funds. In exchange, he received the right to purchase the Tyrolean silver output at below market prices for years to come. Silver was not simply a commodity in the 15th century. Silver was money. The coins that circulated across Europe were made from silver. The man who controlled the silver supply was controlling, in the most direct physical sense, the currency itself. Then, Fugger acquired similar arrangements for copper, the industrial metal of the age. Cannon, church bells, roofing, ship fittings. The entire material infrastructure of 16th century Europe ran on copper. And Fugger didn't just own rights to extract it. He built the entire supply chain, processing facilities, transport networks, warehouses in Antwerp, Lisbon, Venice, commercial relationships with buyers across the continent. He owned the industry from the ground to the final customer. Now, consider the Musk comparison. Tesla makes electric vehicles. Fugger owned the mines that produced the material from which the era's physical currency was struck. SpaceX launches rockets. Fugger controlled the supply of copper that determined whether European powers could arm themselves. These are not equivalent positions. One is a company that participates in markets. The other was the infrastructure those markets depended on. Here's the test I want to apply to both men. Not who was richer in absolute terms, but whose commercial decisions had the larger consequences for human civilization. In 2024, Musk's most consequential single decision is arguably his acquisition of Twitter. Reasonable people disagree about whether that decision was good or bad for public discourse, but its consequences, while significant, are bounded. In 1514, Fugger arranged a loan to Albert of Brandenburg so that Albert could purchase the Archbishopric of Mainz. Albert needed revenue to repay the loan. He was granted permission to sell indulgences, certificates that reduced time in purgatory, in his territory. Half the proceeds went to Rome. Half went to repay the Fuggers. The man Albert appointed to sell those indulgences was a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel. Tetzel's aggressive salesmanship was the specific provocation that led a German monk named Martin Luther to write his 95 Theses. Luther's 95 Theses triggered the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation split Western Christianity. It generated a century of religious wars that killed millions of people. It reshaped the political map of Europe. It transformed philosophy, science, economics, and political theory. Its effects are still visible in the cultural differences between Protestant and Catholic countries today. A direct and documented causal chain runs from a Fugger loan in 1514 to one of the most significant cultural ruptures in Western history. I am not saying Fugger intended this. He was making a loan. But this is what it means to sit at a choke point of sufficient scale. When you control enough of the world's resources, your commercial decisions have consequences that extend far beyond anything you intended or predicted. Musk has not yet triggered a schism in Western civilization. Fugger did, by accident. The Habsburgs were the dominant political dynasty of the 16th century. They ruled the Holy Roman Empire. Through strategic marriages, they controlled Spain, the Netherlands, Burgundy, and were extending their reach into the Americas. They were, in territorial terms, the most powerful family in the world, and they had one consistent structural problem. They were always broke. Their territories were vast, but their revenues were fragmented. Their ambitions, military campaigns, diplomatic marriages, court expenses, consistently outran their ability to collect and deploy their own income. They came to Jakob Fugger repeatedly. He financed Habsburg military campaigns. He funded diplomatic marriages. He advanced money against future revenues that hadn't yet been collected. He became, in effect, the Habsburgs' permanent bank. Now, compare this to Musk's relationship with sovereign power. SpaceX has government contracts. Tesla has benefited from government subsidies and tax incentives. Musk has political relationships with multiple heads of state. He can influence policy through lobbying, media ownership, and public pressure. But can he make himself indispensable to the world's most powerful government in the way Fugger was indispensable to the Habsburgs? No, because no modern government is dependent on a single private lender in the way the Habsburgs were. Central banks exist. Bond markets exist. International financial institutions exist. Every one of these structures was built, directly or indirectly, to ensure that no private individual could ever occupy the position Fugger occupied. He was, in the most precise sense, irreplaceable to the people who ran the world. No private individual in the modern world can make that claim. In 1519, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I died. The Holy Roman Emperor was elected, not inherited. 7 princes held the votes that determined who would rule the most powerful political office in Christendom. 3 of the most powerful monarchs in Europe competed for the position: Francis I of France, Henry VIII of England, Charles I of Spain. All 3 knew that the 7 electoral princes needed to be persuaded. And persuasion in 16th century imperial politics took a specific form. It took the form of very large sums of money. Jakob Fugger backed Charles. He advanced 543,585 florins. That figure is specific because the records are specific. The Fugger archives contain the documentation. On June 28, 1519, the 7 electoral princes voted unanimously. Charles I of Spain became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. The man Fugger had backed was now the most powerful man in the Western world, and he owed his position, documented, archivally provable, to a weaver's grandson from Augsburg. Now ask the obvious question: could Elon Musk do this? Could any private individual in 2024 finance the election of a head of state, secure their victory, and then hold that fact over them as documented leverage? No. Not because no one has thought about it, because the institutional structures of every modern democracy are specifically designed to prevent it. Campaign finance laws, disclosure requirements, anti-corruption statutes, independent electoral commissions. The entire apparatus of modern democratic governance was built in significant part to prevent the next Fugger. After the election, Charles V faced immediate military and political crises. The Ottoman advance into Europe, the Italian wars, the early Reformation, and his debts to Jakob Fugger, which were not being repaid on schedule. So Fugger wrote him a letter. This letter exists. It is held in an archive in Augsburg today, and I want to read you the key passage. Fugger wrote that it was well known that His Imperial Majesty could not have gained the Roman crown, save with Fugger's aid. That Fugger had documentary proof of this from the written statements of all the electoral princes, that he had served the House of Austria at considerable personal risk, and that he expected the emperor to give his debt the attention it deserved and arrange repayment without further delay. A private citizen, writing to the Holy Roman Emperor, telling him, "I made you. I have the receipts. Pay me back," and receiving compliance. Now, I want you to imagine Elon Musk writing this letter to a sitting head of state, to the President of the United States, or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or the Chancellor of Germany. Dear Mr. President, without my financial support, you would not hold this office. I have documentation. Please arrange repayment. What would happen? Congressional investigation. Federal criminal referral. International news coverage for a decade. Possible imprisonment. The letter Fugger sent to Charles V was not extraordinary in his era. It was simply a creditor demanding repayment from a debtor. The fact that the debtor was the most powerful man in the world was a matter of commercial fact, not scandal. That gap between what was normal for Fugger and what is unimaginable for Musk is the measure of how different these two worlds actually were. One more comparison. In 1523, the German Reichstag, the imperial parliament, attempted to pass legislation that would break up Fugger's monopolies. The argument was straightforward. One man controlling this much of the European economy was harmful to the broader commercial community. The argument was, broadly speaking, correct. Fugger's response was to go directly to Charles V, his debtor, the man his money had made emperor, and press him to suppress the legislation. Charles complied. The legislation failed. A private citizen used financial leverage over a sovereign to defeat democratic legislation targeting his own business. Now, compare this to Musk. Musk has lobbied regulatory bodies. He has used his ownership of X to apply political pressure. He has built relationships with politicians across the political spectrum. He has, by various accounts, significant informal influence over policy processes. But has he directly instructed a head of state to suppress legislation targeting his companies? And received compliance? No. Not because he hasn't tried to influence policy. Because the institutional separation between executive power and private commercial interest, however imperfect in practice, is real enough that direct instruction of this kind is not possible. Fugger was not above the law. He was above the lawmakers. That distinction, and the specific institutional history that makes it impossible today, is what this video is actually about. Now let me give Musk his due, because the comparison with Fugger is not meant to diminish what he has actually achieved. And there are things Musk has done that Fugger could not have imagined and would not have attempted. SpaceX has done something genuinely historic. Before SpaceX, launching a kilogram of payload to low Earth orbit cost approximately $10,000. SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket reduced that to approximately $2,000. The Starship program is targeting costs below $100 per kilogram. This is not a marginal improvement. It is a transformation of what is possible for humanity in space. If that program succeeds as projected, it will be one of the most consequential technological achievements of the 21st century. Tesla's role in accelerating the transition to electric vehicles is real and significant. The legacy auto industry was not moving at the pace required to meet climate timelines. Tesla forced it to move faster. That has measurable consequences for atmospheric carbon concentrations over the coming decades. These are not trivial achievements. They are the achievements of someone operating at the absolute frontier of what private capital and organizational will can accomplish within the constraints of a modern democratic economy. The point is not that Musk has failed. The point is that the constraints he operates within are real, and Fugger had no equivalent constraints. One man's extraordinary achievement within a well-designed system, another man's extraordinary achievement in the absence of any system that could check him. These are different things. Both are worth understanding. Here is the question that this comparison forces us to ask. Why can't anyone be Fugger rich today? It is not simply that the global economy is larger and therefore any individual share is smaller. It is that the institutional architecture of the modern world was specifically designed to prevent the concentration of private power that Fugger represented. Central banks, invented to ensure that sovereign governments are never dependent on a single private lender. Antitrust law, invented to prevent the kind of market monopolies Fugger held over silver and copper. Securities regulation, invented to prevent the opacity that allowed Fugger's information advantages to generate returns that other market participants couldn't match. Democratic accountability, invented at enormous cost over centuries to ensure that legislative processes cannot be overridden by private financial leverage. Every one of these institutions has a history, and in that history, somewhere is a moment when a private family demonstrated that without this institution, wealth could be converted into a kind of power that no democratic society should permit. Fugger was one of those demonstrations. The Medicis were another. The Rothschilds were another. We built the modern world, in significant part, as a response to what these families showed was possible. The fact that Elon Musk cannot be Fugger rich is not a failure of capitalism. It is the success of the institutional constraints that make capitalism compatible with democracy. Whether those constraints are currently strong enough is a different and genuinely important question. It's a one that I will leave for the comments. Elon Musk is not rich, not by the standards of the people we discuss on this channel. But I want to be clear about what that means. It is not an insult. It is a statement about the world we have built. The reason Musk cannot buy an election, cannot write a letter to a head of state demanding repayment, cannot use a sovereign's debt as leverage to suppress legislation he doesn't like, is that we spent 5 centuries building institutions to prevent exactly that. The Medicis made it necessary. The Fuggers made it urgent. The Rothschilds made it undeniable. And then, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous amounts of political violence along the way, we built the regulatory, democratic, and financial structures that made the next Fugger impossible. Whether we have built those structures well enough, whether the concentration of private wealth in the modern world is approaching a point where those structures need to be strengthened, whether Musk, or someone like him, might eventually be able to do what Fugger did in a different form. These are questions worth asking, and I would rather ask them with a clear understanding of the historical precedent than without one. That is what this channel is for. Here is what I want to know from you. Who is the closest modern equivalent to Jakob Fugger? Not in terms of raw net worth, but in terms of the leverage their wealth gives them over sovereign political power. Who, today, is the most structurally indispensable private actor to the governments that run the world? Leave your answer in the comments. because I think it is one of the most important questions in contemporary political economy. And I genuinely don't know the right answer. If you want the full Jakob Fugger story, how he built his monopolies, how he financed the imperial election, how he wrote that letter to Charles V, and what happened to the dynasty after his death. That full 2-part series is coming next week on our channel. If you are not subscribed, now is the time. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.